Stephen Avery has many virtues. Being a meticulous housekeeper and cleaner is not among them. And at least if you believe the story that the police got Brendan Dassey to adopt, there would have been a bloody mess in Steven Avery's bedroom.
So we have here most notably known for his representation of Steven Avery during his 2007 murder trial, along with the Making a Murder documentary, criminal defense attorney Dean Strang. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
I appreciate you doing this. I appreciate you taking the time. It's a pleasure to have you. Since it's just your first time coming on, let's kind of go back to the beginning. Where are you from originally?
South side of Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
What was childhood like coming up for you? Both parents?
Both parents. Easy childhood. Lucky childhood. Luck is sort of the through line in my life, at least so far. It's going to run out at some point. But no, I had two college-educated parents, both of them strivers, and they loved each other. They loved their two kids. It really was a very, very fortunate upbringing. They were very different people who needed each other, who, like I guess many successful marriages, the one's strengths were the other's deficits and the other way around. So I had very different relationships with my father and my mother, but both of them were good relationships. And as I say, they were sort of middle-class stock, and I guess, they didn't rise above that. That's fine, but my sister and I never wondered if there was going to be dinner.
And at what point did you decide you wanted to go into law school and become an attorney?
I guess relatively late, certainly compared to how focused and driven and purposeful many law students today are. I was always going to be an editorial cartoonist. That was my big dream. And I abandoned that the spring of my junior year in college, which was a mature decision. It was the right decision. It was an unexpected and sort of momentary flash of maturity there for a couple of weeks where I just rethought what I had planned since I was probably 7 or 8 years old about being a cartoonist. Decided that wasn't going to be what I wanted to do for 50 years, much as I loved doing it. And I didn't have a plan B at all. I just had no plan B. But my dad had an older sister who was a lawyer, actually here in Chicago. And my dad, because he thought I was facile with words and could write, express myself both by spoken word and written word. He always had said, you ought to be a lawyer. He didn't like much the idea of being a cartoonist. He thought it was doodling. He knew I wasn't going to be an engineer like him because I had no aptitude for
numbers.
Well, and fixing things, and I wasn't interested in machinery or. So he had always encouraged me to be a lawyer, and I did have this. It was a quite remarkable example of one of his older sisters, my Aunt Eileen, who was a lawyer and had gone to law school when women just did not do that. She graduated in 1952 from the University of Michigan Law School. I think she was one of 3 women in the whole law school.
Wow.
At the time, and really she was a complicated and often difficult person, but she was an inspiring person. And so I did have that model in the family. I decided I would go to law school. That would give me some time to decide what I wanted to do. And I had the general sense, even as a junior and senior in college, accurate, I think, that in our culture, in this country, law is a pass key to a lot of things. There are a lot of potential jobs and callings open to you with a law degree. So I thought that it would be flexible for someone who didn't know exactly what he wanted to do.
Did you know originally that you wanted to go into criminal defense?
Not at all. I wanted nothing to do with a courtroom, wanted nothing to do with the conflict of litigation. I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I figured it would be in an office, would involve helping people solve problems rather than fight. It would not be conflictual or adversarial, is what I thought. And my, required first year criminal law course in law school left me cold. But I just didn't connect with the course or the man teaching it or anything about it. I think quite immaturely and in the sheltered, way in some ways that I had grown up, I couldn't imagine what criminal law had to do with me.
At what point did you realize that you were gonna venture down that road to criminal law?
That was all flukes, Russell. It was all fortuity and fluke. But when I took my first job with a relatively large civil firm out of law school, the little bit older lawyer, she was 3 or 4 years ahead of me, who was assigned by the firm to be my mentor, or my
Something.
my big sister or whatever it was. She and I hit it off. She thought I would enjoy her husband, who was a young public defender. And I did. I mean, he and I very quickly became good friends. They were not from Wisconsin, so their social circle was other young public defenders with whom he worked. And I became part of that social circle quickly. So I was surrounded by all these young, engaging, bright, funny public defenders, and started thinking, their stories are good. What they're doing is important. Many of the stories they told were tragic. Some of them were inspiring. The clients they were working with, just hearing secondhand the stories of the work they were doing and of the people they were doing it for, got me interested in criminal law. And then, again, fortuitously, the man who was, I still think, the best criminal defense lawyer Wisconsin's ever produced, wound up being hired by a client of ours at the civil firm where I was to take the lead in a civil case that was going to go to trial in federal court in Detroit. None of us were happy about that. He'd only ever had one civil case before. He was a renowned criminal defense lawyer, but not at all a civil lawyer. He made a very bad first impression on me and just about everybody else at our firm. And then I'll leave out the details, but about a week after I met him, I was in love with him. I was absolutely taken with this guy's audacity, his brilliance, his mischief, and his passion for what he was doing. And between those young public defenders and this, at that point, 59-year-old, really premier private criminal defense lawyer, I got interested in it. And he eventually hired me, gave me my first job in criminal defense, which was, again, just sort of a remarkable bit of luck, because at that time, there were 100 or 200 or 500 other lawyers in Wisconsin who would have
Taking that.
cut off their right arm to get a job in that firm. But he hired me.
And you started off as a federal public defender, or was it?
No, I did everything backwards once I got into criminal defense. I started as an associate with this man's firm. His second partner was his wife, who also became a great mentor to me. And then they had a third partner, younger, quite a bit younger than the two of them, but still 16 years older than me. And he also became really one of the one of the most important mentors of my life. So I've been blessed with a lot of good mentors, but these three, I think I'd probably have to put someone,
The most important.
as the most important probably. And so I was with them eventually because my name wasn't on the door, and so it was hard to bring in work of my own. I eventually split off with another very talented guy who was my age and at another excellent criminal defense firm in Milwaukee. We partnered up, and from there, I went to the Federal Defender's Office after about 3 years in that partnership.
And what year was this?
That I went to the Federal Defender's Office. I started there August 1, 2000.
Gotcha. And then after that, you went into private practice again, correct?
Again, yeah. I spent 5 years in the Federal Defender's Office, almost to the day, by design, and then went back into private practice. So for me, public defending wasn't the starting point in terms of my jobs. The public defenders launched me on this, but I didn't become a public defender until I had been out of law school for over 15 years. Did that for 5 years and then went back into private practice. So, it was an extended interlude, but not a starting point as it would be for most criminal defense lawyers.
Sure. Did you have anybody you looked up to at the time, like the Johnny Cochrans of the world, or any of these, renowned criminal defense attorneys that you kind of wanted to emulate, or
I was working for them.
Yeah,
I was
all in your office.
And Shello and Steve Glynn and Gilda Shello, I was working for them, and through Jim especially, I got to meet and heard great stories about others I didn't meet.
Sure.
Many of the most well-known criminal defense lawyers in the country. Jim knew them all. He had been in the mid-1970s, had been the president of the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. And he really was a towering figure in criminal defense from the 60s to the early 2000s. And, was controversial. There were people who really didn't like him. He was a very difficult man in many respects, which he never hid. He was utterly authentic, and a lot of that authenticity was very difficult.
Yeah.
He was also, if you could take the bad, he was at core a lovely human being who was driven to keep people out of cages.
Did you prefer state or federal, or do you prefer state or federal? Do you have a preference? Which you like more?
I if you put it that way, I probably lean a little bit federal, but the better answer is that the joys and the sorrows of state practice and federal practice are different. They in some ways complement each other. So for myself, I think I was happiest doing criminal defense when I had a good mix of both federal cases and state cases.
When you get these clients, and they're charged with, murder and these violent crimes, or any crime that could potentially send them away for, 30, 40, 50, 60 life, whatever that number is that a lot of pressure to deal with?
It better be.
Yeah.
If it's not, you shouldn't be doing this. If it's not, if you don't feel the pressure from that,
yeah,
you are not doing the right job. You should be doing something else altogether. And I felt enormous pressure with that. And as I say, should have. That's the right thing to feel. Now you have to have a boundary between thee and me.
Yeah.
You have to preserve a sense of self and know sort of what's too much.
Have some limits.
I guess boundaries. I don't know about limits, but boundaries. Because if you're destroyed by one client's case, what about your other clients?
Sure.
They have every right to demand all of you, all your skill, all your focus, all your commitment. They all have an equal claim to that. So, yeah, you better care, or you just shouldn't be doing it.
Sure.
But you also then have to have enough in the tank
To keep going with everyone else.
that you're not shorting anybody else.
So then you're kind of, this is, I'm assuming around the early 2000s. And then, fast forward a few years, you get to 2005 and Teresa Halbach comes up missing. Before you even got involved in this and had any acknowledgement, of kind of what was going on, or Steven Avery on a personal level, had you heard about this case, about the missing person report, I should say?
Well, I think, I was living in Milwaukee, and she was not reported missing right away, but 3-4 days later, whenever it was, that she was reported missing, you almost couldn't be in Wisconsin unless you were under a rock and not hear about it. And the name Steven Avery was familiar to me because the firm I mentioned had represented him for a time back when he was in prison on the 1985
For the rape
conviction for the crime he didn't commit.
Sure.
So I never met him personally during that time, but two of the lawyers in the firm were representing him. So I knew his backstory, and was, just generally aware of his legal history.
And when that happened, he had been out of prison 1.5 years, 2 years, roughly?
I think it was a little over 2, something like that.
Yeah. How did you initially get involved in that case?
I wasn't initially involved in the case. He had a public defender once he was charged with Teresa Halbach's murder. And my former partner and mentor, Steve Glynn, by that time now was representing Steven Avery again on a civil claim against Manitowoc County officials for their misconduct that led to his 1985 wrongful conviction. And during the course of that civil case, Steven got arrested and charged with this new homicide. Steven wanted a privately retained lawyer. I think he was awash in the common and really misplaced and unfortunate bias against public defenders that pervades prisons and jails. And he just had the idea that, you're better off with a paid lawyer.
Sure.
Which isn't often not true. But I also understanding wanting to have the power and the means financially to pick your lawyer rather than have the public defender pick your lawyer. So Steve Glynn and the lawyer he was handling the civil case with gave Steven my name and a couple of other names. I know Jerry Buting was one of the other names. I've never known who the third, or if there were 4 or 5 names. I don't know who they were. But Steve Glynn rightly always gave multiple names so that a client could interview and, pick the lawyer with whom he or she was most comfortable. Steven and his family, after meeting with me, did want to hire me, but they also liked Jerry Buting. And I like working with Jerry. We've never been in the same firm together, but we had collaborated on cases before and represented husband, wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, co-defendants in cases. And so it was I who suggested, I haven't talked to Jerry, but you're interested in him. I love working with him. We have complementary skills. I could talk to him and see whether on the money you have available, we could make this work by splitting the money and doing the case together. And I did that, and Jerry was, at least potentially interested. And Jerry and I met in my office the day that Brendan Dassey was arrested. That happened while we were meeting.
Oh, wow. Really?
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of Brendan Dassey, obviously he's got the whole confession and things like that. Did his mom ever give the police authority to question him at the school? Or how did they end up at
Not that I know. Now, I've never, obviously never represented Brendan, and it's been 18 years now since I was hired.
Sure.
And Brendan was charged. But I don't remember his mother, Barb Yanda, ever giving the police permission to talk to their son. I think they just came to the school and took him out of class. Yeah, that's my recollection.
Yeah, no, that was mine. That's what I was under the belief as well. What are the laws in Wisconsin regarding questioning a juvenile? Is there laws that say they have to have a parent present, or
not necessarily? No,
really,
no. And the law in Wisconsin changed judicially right around the time Brendan was arrested, a little after, I don't remember now, on a case that was completely unrelated to Brendan. But the Wisconsin Supreme Court strengthened a little bit the protections of juveniles in custody by requiring that the police make a recording in the interview from beginning to end. But in terms of warnings about the right to a lawyer, the right to remain silent, no, then and now, in Wisconsin, juveniles are treated as if they were 40 years old.
That's surprising that they wouldn't require a parent or guardian to at least sign off on that or say, okay, you can question my child or at least be present. Like, I'm surprised that that's not put in place.
It has been since, in part, I think, because of Brendan Dassey's known experience, thanks to making a murderer. There are some states that have strengthened those kinds of protections for kids who are in police custody. Most states have not. And I don't know that I'd call that surprising, given, what I know about how our criminal enforcement works in this country. I think it's appalling.
Sure. Good choice of words. I would imagine this is the kind of case that every lawyer kind of dreams about, the OJ case, the Casey Anthony, the Steven Avery. What's the, I guess, mindset or, again, pressure trying to handle a case and prepare for a case of that magnitude?
Well, so you used the word every lawyer dreams of. And keep in mind that good dreams mostly are confined to songs, right? Our actual dreams are often strange, surreal, scary. If they're really bad, they're nightmares. And so dream is maybe the right choice of word, but not in a pop song sense or a child's fairy tale kind of sense. A case like this, on the one hand, it can be invigorating to take the case, make your heart speed up.
Does it consume you?
It can do that. It can scare the hell out of you and often will. It can feel very burdensome dealing with a case that's getting intense media coverage. Forget documentary films and, the really rare situation, but just a case that's getting intense local media coverage is hard as a lawyer. You have to anticipate when the media will be present. Is it print media and electronic media? These days you have to think about alternative media, social media, podcasters, just private people who are able to enter into journalism, so to speak, because the entry barriers have fallen so low. thanks to technology. So you really have to be anticipating all of that. When am I going to have a camera put in my face or a microphone shoved at me? What can I say? What should I say? What am I ethically obliged to not say? What do I have a compelling and ethical reason to say? All of that you have to be thinking through in advance in a way that requires no thought at all for 99% of cases that get no media coverage. So it's a different experience, and it can be tiring. It I guess burdensome. My first word is a good word for it. There are times when it can feel exhilarating, especially if you're a ham and you want to see yourself on the 6 o'clock news or something. Lawyers react in different ways to it, but it's just very different than almost all criminal cases that get no attention.
Sure. Do you feel like the presumption of innocence can get lost with that kind of immediate attention?
In a heartbeat, and almost always does. That's one of the pressures of it, because the traditional media, local radio, local television, if the case, if it's really rare and it's drawing some national attention, same thing. Local print media, to the extent that's still around, the first narrative they hear is from the police and the prosecution, and they have the charging document. They have often police press conferences, prosecutor press conferences. They've consumed the prosecution narrative and the police narrative before the defendant even has a lawyer, let alone has that lawyer offered any coherent
rebuttal
or narrative to the contrary, any coherent narrative at all. And you can see why the presumption of innocence, which is a nice but awfully abstract and theoretical construct anyway, just disappears. It collapses when what people are consuming through the media is a narrative of guilt.
Do you think, obviously, the prosecution gave that initial press conference where they kind of laid out, I think he had mentioned if you're under a certain age to cover your ears or not watch the TV or whatever. I don't remember verbatim exactly what he said, but
you're talking about Ken Kratz, the lead prosecutor on the case.
Yeah.
He essentially slapped a PG-13 or R rating on this mid-afternoon live press conference. And Jerry Buting describes the effect of that better than I ever have. Sort of paraphrase Jerry, when Ken Kratz said that, the effect, of course, was everybody turns up the volume on the television. Oh, this is going to be juicy. This is going to be good. You're drawing eyes, not, nobody's actually turning off the TV, which is what Ken Kratz was suggesting for children or people who knew Teresa Halbach.
What were your thoughts when he did? Like, how do you combat something like that? Just basically try to go to the judge and get a gag ordered?
I was really angry about that press conference. Jerry and I both were, without even touching base with each other. Enraged would be a strong word, but not necessarily too strong in this context. I thought it really out of bounds. As a matter of fair play and maybe as a matter of actual legal ethics. So we did go to the judge on that with a motion just to dismiss the case because he had, in our view, tainted any possibility of an unbiased jury drawn from anywhere in the state, because even in its early days, since Teresa Halbach had disappeared, this investigation and then the prosecution was getting heavy coverage in all 7 major media markets that are either in or overlap Wisconsin. It was getting heavy coverage out of the Twin Cities, which, has That's a media market that includes western Wisconsin in part. So we thought there's nowhere you could go within the state of Wisconsin where a jury pool would not have been tainted by that press conference, which, as I say, I thought then crossed well over the bounds of decency and maybe legal ethics, and just was grotesque.
Do you think there's a fine line between being strategic and maybe playing dirty?
I don't know how fine the line is. There's a difference. There's absolutely a difference. And I have no way of knowing whether Ken Kratz and the sheriff at the time intended to play dirty. They should have known better if they weren't intending it. But, I have no way of knowing their actual motives. If it was strategy, it was a dumb strategy because it was bound to create problems for them.
Sure. When you start getting into the case, you and Jerry, and you start getting discovery and start getting the evidence and kind of see what the state, what their case is going to be, what the evidence they have, et cetera, what are your initial thoughts about the hardest obstacles and hurdles to overcome going into this?
In this case?
Yes.
There was
what did you think the hardest pieces or the hardest pieces of evidence?
Well, there were human remains 15 feet outside his bedroom window.
Sure.
In his fire pit. That's hard.
It is.
And there was nobody who was coming forward saying that we saw Teresa Hallbach after she left the Avery salvage yard property. Now, his post-conviction lawyer, Kathleen Zellner, has found somebody, who at least saw her car after that. I'm convinced one or more other people saw her after she finished her conversation with Steven Avery and taking pictures of his sister's minivan. But nobody had ever admitted that. And so you have, the inference that the last person known to have seen her might well be culpable for her disappearance and murder. And his blood was found on the dashboard or, near the ignition.
And under the hood.
And under the hood. Well, his DNA, I guess, was found on the hood latch, but his blood was found next to the ignition in her car. The A key to her car was found purportedly in plain view on the floor of his bedroom. I think that was not reliable evidence, to put it politely.
No, I agree.
But, this was all, these were just pieces of information that were in the police reports and crime lab reports and, other information we were given at the outset of the case.
Sure. No, and I've been on the receiving end of police searches, and they're usually pretty thorough, and when I saw the key, I would lean towards, I believe the key was probably planted. They're thorough in my searches, and this is just Russell with maybe some drugs in the car. You're talking about Steven Avery, with a homicide. I can't imagine that they wouldn't have kind of torn that room apart and searched it thoroughly.
Well, they had searched it several times,
right?
5-6 times before
found it on the 7th.
Before the key gets found lying on the carpet. I believe I wasn't there. I believe that key was planted by the police.
Yeah.
That's what I believe. I would take the probably out of it. That's what I believe. Again, I didn't see it happen.
Regarding the key and the search and everything like that, why was, or why were deputies from Manitowoc County allowed to be on the residence or be involved in the search with a pending, they were set to, I believe, give a deposition regarding the civil matter, correct?
Some had been deposed, some were still to be deposed. Their purported recusal from the investigation was not required by state law. There was no outside intervening agency that insisted on it. It was, in that sense, a voluntary chosen recusal by the sheriff's department. They lied about the actual role that in the end that Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department played in the case. The fact that they lied about it, that they told the public they had nothing to do with the investigation other than perimeter management, crowd control, peripheral roles, raises a question about, if you're not doing anything wrong, why did you lie about your role? The fact of the matter was that over the roughly 7 days when that entire property was under police control and repeated searches inside and outside the buildings on the salvage yard were ongoing, every single significant piece of physical evidence later introduced at Steven Avery's trial or Brendan Dassey's, every single significant piece of physical evidence first was identified or found by members of the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department. The car was first seen by a citizen, but the first law enforcement to respond and see the car after the citizen summoned the police were members of the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department.
And didn't the citizen have some ties to the sheriff's department or something like that?
Yeah, well, to the Halbach family and maybe to law enforcement. I've forgotten the details of that. But the public was not told the truth by the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department about its actual role in the investigation. But the limitation of that role was not something compelled by Wisconsin law. So I guess if you're voluntarily recusing, you can voluntarily unrecuse. Just why the gap in the truth and the story you're telling about it?
And if I'm not mistaken, the state claims that she was murdered in the garage, correct? Or she was shot in the garage.
At Steven's trial, that was the working theory on which they settled.
I just find it hard to believe that there wouldn't have been blood on certain. I believe they said they had found cleaner on the floor, but I mean, I still can't imagine blood spatter not being on any equipment or boxes or whatever the surrounding components would be.
I can't either, because Steven Avery has many virtues. Being a meticulous housekeeper and cleaner is not among them. And at least if you believe the story that the police got Brendan Dassey to adopt, there would have been a bloody mess in Steven Avery's bedroom. His bed, his mattress would have been soaked with blood. There would have been hair, hacked off hair. There just would have been all kinds of.
There wasn't any
gruesome physical evidence.
Alien shackles either, right?
No.
Yeah.
No. And let alone any blood, hair, anything, identified as connected in any way with Teresa Halbach or any crime in the bedroom where supposedly this violent rape and gruesome murder took place. Now, you pointed out, well, was she shot in the garage or was she stabbed repeatedly and had her throat sliced wide open while tied to a bed in the bedroom? Those are two very different stories about a homicide. Neither one of them with impressive or any evidentiary support in the case of the bedroom theory. As to the garage, there was a flattened .22 shell found in the garage 3 months or more after the garage had been repeatedly searched. And there was a I think what the forensic pathologist called a defect in a fragment of skull bone, consistent with the entry of a bullet. Now, it was impossible to say whether that bullet would have been fired before death, around the time of death, or after death. But so you had some potential circumstantial evidence supporting a gunshot theory, but that's utterly irreconcilable with the other theory of how she died.
Right. And even on the key, if you have transferable DNA, his fingerprint would have had to go exactly above hers in the same exact spot, I would assume, correct?
I don't know about that. I don't know. But you would expect if it was her car key, she'd have more, that her DNA would be found on the car key, not just his.
Right. Speaking hypothetically, if Brendan Dassey had never confessed, do you believe that Steven Avery would have still been convicted? Or
Brendan didn't testify against him, and Brendan's statements were not introduced
right
at Steven's trial. However, this story that the police persuaded Brendan to adopt during the most important of their questioning sessions with Brendan, that was the heart of the press conference you and I have described. That was the horror movie script that gripped the public and that reverberated, through the media, the unforgettable, gruesome tale of a woman's assault and death. And that, which wasn't part of the evidence at trial, nonetheless, stuck with anybody who heard it, including me. You can't unhear that when you've heard that. It turns out to be false, unsupported, a figment of somebody's imagination, largely or wholly, but you can't unhear it. You're influenced by it. And I don't think we had a juror who wasn't aware of that story that was attributed to Brendan Dassey, but in fact spun out by the police with his inarticulate adoption along the way. So it's hard to know, just how much of Steven Avery's conviction rests on actual evidence the jury heard, how much of it rests on the suppositions and beliefs the jury brought into the trial. I don't know that we'll ever unscramble that. What I do know is that the way that statement was taken was revolting, unreliable, should have been illegal. Indeed, a federal judge in Milwaukee, initially 2 out of 3 federal judges in the Court of Appeals in Chicago, and eventually, a bare minority of all of the federal Court of Appeals judges in Chicago thought it was illegal. And by one vote, that confession, that statement survived legal scrutiny in the end in federal court. It doesn't make it right. It's never made it reliable. It was in large measure disproven, but it tainted everything once it became public.
Yeah. I know Kathleen Zellner is currently working on, Steven Avery's post-conviction. Do you know if Brendan Dassey has anybody working on his as well, or what's going on with that? Or
it still has the Center for Wrongful Convictions at Northwestern University's law school.
Gotcha. Again, speaking hypothetically, do you think that Steven Avery's and or Brendan Dassey's will get overturned one day?
I have no idea. I sure hope so. I cannot articulate how much I hope both of those men's convictions get overturned. and we get somewhere closer to the truth of what actually happened here and who did it, to Teresa Halbach, I can't tell you how fervently I hope that. I think the wrong men are in prison. I think we've never gotten to the truth of what happened to this poor young woman, and it matters.
And I believe you had mentioned at one point there's a law in Wisconsin saying that you can't point the finger at somebody unless you have sufficient evidence to prove that. Like, you can't bring up an alternate suspect.
Well, this case, and you're looking at one of the lawyers who shares the blame or bears the blame for this. This case resulted in a higher standard that the defense now has to meet in Wisconsin to offer an alternative suspect, offer evidence of an alternative suspect for the crime. That standard was always fairly stiff, or had been since the mid-1980s, fairly stiff in Wisconsin. And as a result of this case, the burden on the defense got raised even higher.
Regarding Steven's mom, I know she's since passed on. What was she like? I relate her to kind of my own mother, and I put my own mother through hell by doing some of the things I did. I could see the pain in her eyes when I saw the documentary. I don't think a lot of people really realize the domino effect that things like these cause. What was she like? I'm sure this probably tore her apart, mentally and emotionally.
It had to.
Yeah.
It had to. She was a stoic. I think she'd seen a lot of pain and hardship in her life, probably all her life. It didn't appear to me to have great expectations about what life would hold for her. But there was unmistakable pain at having a son go through what he did for 18 years, being in 1985, and then to be charged again and be reliving the same really questionable accusations, and the same really questionable law enforcement motives and competence all over again. Dolores Avery was, in my experience, was a simple, which is not to say simple-minded, but a simple, transparent, plodding, plodding woman who tried to survive, who simply worked to survive and maintain a measure of optimism, a measure of faith in other human beings. She was a really... I liked Dolores. Dolores was someone who was approachable and unguarded. She had a lot of reason, for example, to be maybe skeptical of lawyers or suspicious of lawyers. And that's not how she approached lawyers. She approached you as one human being to another. I liked her. And Alan Avery also was, I could say many of the very same things about Alan. These are people who have very hard lives.
Sure.
Alan's still alive, and they just have very hard lives. But they've borne it. They've borne up to it and tried to maintain a measure of optimism about the world and the people in it.
When the jury came back with a guilty verdict, what did that do to you emotionally? How did that affect you?
Badly.
Yeah.
I mean, heavily. All verdicts do, and if it's a verdict of guilt in a case where the mandatory sentence is life in prison, you remember those. You don't bounce back from that immediately. I felt, I think, physically sort of nauseous at the time.
Did you go through depression?
I do after every trial.
Yeah.
It's situational. I come to understand.
Sure. No, I get.
I go through a period of depression after the rare trial that I win.
Yeah. No, I get.
You know, you're riding on adrenaline during a trial, and then it's over, and you crash. But you know, that's different. That's different than the emotional reaction to a verdict that's going to result in a devastating sentence and that you think is really wrong, is just factually wrong. And there's nothing you can do about it at the moment.
Do you think this is a situation where the state of Wisconsin would fear, I guess, the retribution of a pending lawsuit should they let him out? So therefore that dollar amount would be so high that they can't just subject themselves to that?
Well, that's that's an appealing possibility. I understand exactly what you mean by that. The state of Wisconsin is inanimate. It has no fears. It's a construct, a legal construct. Specific people who are involved in this, who may have authored this miscarriage of justice, I suspect are quite happy to have things remain just as they are and to have no further light shed on the events of Teresa Halbach's death. Mostly they aren't in positions of authority anymore in the state of Wisconsin. So I do understand your question, but it's in many ways an abstraction for the reasons I've just tried to explain.
Regarding the criminal justice system as a whole, what do you think the biggest flaw is, or the biggest flaws?
Well, I could start with the fact that you and so many of us refer to it as the criminal justice system. I think of it as a criminal enforcement system. It's rare, to my eye, and accidental when justice has anything at all to do with it, really. Some people aspire to justice, including people in the system, but that's not how the system tends to operate. In fact, it doesn't often bring any real sense of justice to victims of crime. It doesn't often bring any sense of justice to the people accused of crimes. Heavens know that citizen witnesses, usually I think don't feel any sense of justice being done. Sometimes people feel a sense of being heard, and that's important. That's a first step, but being heard doesn't get you to justice. It just maybe opens the door for the possibility of justice. And it's hard for me as someone who was a voluntary participant in the system, to look at it and say that it did justice or that it does justice other than haphazardly or almost by accident. And I know that sounds terribly cynical, but I don't mean it to sound quite as cynical as it probably sounds. The fact of the matter is that all of these institutions are composed of nothing but human beings. People who put on one sock at a time, people who have good days and bad days, people who do terrible things and occasionally do wonderful, gracious things. We're all flawed. We're all frail. And there's nowhere else to look for, some supervening force that brings us justice. There are no superheroes in the system. And we have to sort of live with that. For me, at least what we could be doing and should be doing is describing our efforts and the results of those efforts with a lot more humility than we almost ever do. With a lot more humility about whether we got it right, whether we came anywhere close to fairness, let alone justice, whether we ameliorated any injustice. And those lofty goals, though, are not what drive the people in the institutions and the institutions themselves day in and day out. Just to be blunt, I think what drives those institutions that together in assemblage make a system of criminal enforcement are captivity of other human beings and surveillance of other suspect human beings and classes of human beings. It's about captivity and surveillance, and how that perpetuates jobs and profit for private industry and the economic vitality of small communities where prisons are built in out-of-the-way places, you name it. Justice just doesn't even enter into the work, the day-to-day work of people who volunteer to serve that system. Now, I don't mean just police or judges or prosecutors. I'm including defense lawyers. I'm including bailiffs and, clerks, probation agents, all of us who are the voluntary participants in this. Day to day, I think, spend next to no time considering what's just and unjust.
Do you think that the people involved in these systems are aware that they're helping kind of perpetuate this infrastructure, or however you want to word it? Do you think that they're aware of exactly what they're contributing to, I should say?
You're only aware of it if you're willing to think of it.
Sure.
If you're willing to actually
acknowledge it,
think about it, confront it. And there's a brilliant segmentation of responsibility in the system of criminal enforcement, is in the way there is in large corporations and lots of other systems. There's a brilliant segmentation of responsibility, so nobody has to own all of it. All you own is a little tiny piece, and you're always therefore left with the refuge of saying, well, I only did this. Other actors had responsibility for everything else. So, just, to walk through it quickly and in a sort of superficial way, the police can always say, I just investigate. And if there's probable cause, I arrest. The DA prosecutor decides whether to charge. That's not me. Prosecutor says, well, I just consider the cases the police bring to me. And if there's probable cause, I'll charge often. And a judge will decide whether there's reason for the case to go to trial, and a jury will decide guilt if there is a trial. I'm just doing my part. I'm just representing the people. And I don't make the decisions in the end. And the judge can say, well, the DA decides whom to charge and with what. I'm just here to make sure the process is fair and to decide, is there, minimal reason to let this case go forward? And the U.S. Supreme Court and every state Supreme Court has said minimal reason, probable cause is all that's necessary. I just apply the law. I don't make it. I'm just overseeing the trial. I'm a neutral. I'm a referee. The jury will decide what to do. The lawyers will argue it out. The defense lawyer gets to say, I did my best. I defended my guy. I've got too many cases, especially if I'm a public defender. I only get 24 hours in a day. I did what I can do. And the jury decides and the judge decides. And, the judge makes the legal decisions. The jury makes the factual decisions. I don't get to do that. The Court of Appeals says the jury did what it did. That's entitled to deference. The judge decided what she did or he did, and we'll only overrule that if it's an abuse of discretion, usually. Even if it's a legal error, we're only going to set aside the outcome if we think it was not harmless, ordinarily. And we might have decided some of these discretionary calls differently, but that's not our job to substitute our discretion for the trial judges. And we don't get to substitute our view of the evidence for the juries. We're just here to make sure this is somehow more or less legally antiseptic. and on it goes. Nobody
All down to the parole and probation and the
absolutely.
correctional officers.
Sure.
That's a good point.
The corrections officers didn't put you in prison.
They're just doing their job.
They're obeying a judge's order that you should be held in a prison for X number of years. And, in a lot of these small communities, where as a matter of carceral geography in this country, we tend to put prisons, a corrections officer may be the best damn job you're ever going to have. And they are generational jobs in many places in this country. My grandfather did it. My father did it, and I've followed them into the prison, into being a corrections officer. And because I have this fairly good job for the community in which I'm living, I can afford to go deer hunting, during deer season, or I can afford to take my kids to a baseball game, or, I didn't put this guy there. I'm just here to try to keep other inmates and my fellow corrections officers safe and keep that inmate safe. Nobody has to own the whole of it because the responsibility is so segmented.
Oh, you broke that down really well. I like how you kind of just, it makes sense, and I agree with you.
But the overall picture is pretty dismal.
Sure.
And pretty hard to defend.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're watching this in anywhere near 2024, about 2 million people will go to bed behind bars tonight in the land of the free and the home of the brave.
When did you start to feel like that? Like how long into your career did you start to see like things weren't what you thought they were, or things weren't quite how they should be, or was there something in particular, or was it just a series of events over?
Nothing in particular, and I'm not any more perspicacious than most people, but my first job in criminal law actually was as a federal prosecutor for 10 and a half months. I was terrible. I was bad at it, and I didn't like it. I wasn't in the right place for me. I didn't have the spine for it. And it was there that I first began to think, is this really what we ought to be doing? Is this actually, are the incentives what they ought to be? Are the results what they ought to be? And I was a participant, a voluntary participant in that. I got out after 10 and a half months. Prosecution just was not for me. That became clear to me. But, I guess to my discredit, I had to be in it. I had to be in that courthouse and in that work before I really began to take notice of how it operated. I'd been happy as a law student, as I told you before, and before I went to law school, to think, this has nothing to do with me. I'll never find myself there. If you'd asked me, I might have said, I don't think I'll ever find myself the victim of a serious crime. I had the sort of hubris that you can grow up with if you're lucky in this country. But most people don't have that kind of luck. And I had or maintained a kind of insulation until I got involved in it. And even then, there was no aha moment. It was just a process of accretion in trying to watch with open eyes and listen to what was going on around me.
Sure. How big of a role do you think mental health and addiction play in all of this?
Enormous.
Yeah.
Not universal in every crime, but, overuse of alcohol, reliance on addictive drugs, alcohol and others, drive a lot of both petty and serious crime. What we think of as crime, and it, often is crime in terms of victimizing people, a lot of it. And I can't quantify that, but you and I both know that, lots and lots of both perpetrators of crime and victims of crime are intoxicated somehow, on something, at the time that everything goes to hell for them. And, personality disorders, cognitive disorders, emotional disorders, these are in many ways probably more common than not. Some of them not effectively treatable. Some of them could be treated. But the criminal enforcement system, jails, prisons, become the treatment providers of last resort, often in this country, which is an enormous moral failing. It's a budgetary failing. It's an allocation of resources failing. But budgets are moral documents. Government choices on spending are moral choices. And, again, some people who get pulled into the criminal enforcement system, whether as the defendant or as a victim, have mental health disorders that are really quite resistant to effective treatment. But others have quite treatable conditions, and for whatever reason, don't get effective treatment until they're locked up.
Do you think that it's only a funding problem regarding?
No.
Or do you think it's intentional?
I wouldn't call it intentional. I would call it a malign neglect, a willful blindness, and probably a frustration with how to solve problems that often are insoluble or nearly insoluble. There's a lot of broken human beings, and many of them just are not fixable in the end. All that said, we could be doing better with many people than we are in fact doing. And prisons and jails are not first-order places to be delivering mental health treatment. They're not. And yet, for no small number of people, the first time they get any sort of real mental health intervention is when they're in custody.
Some of these are like really complex issues. You obviously have underlying issues and, dual diagnosis and things like that. Where do you think we even begin as a whole to kind of fix all of this?
I don't know. If I knew the answer to that, I'd be running for president or something, or probably wouldn't be doing that. But Russell, I don't know. I can tell you what I've seen. I can't offer anything more than just some fragments about where I would begin to try to address some of the problems. Big picture stuff, we have a very punitive mindset and social policy in this country. We always have, or at least, since after Reconstruction. I mean, there's been a very punitive mindset for complex reasons in this country, and punitiveness is in constant tension with recognizing mental health problems and treating them and fully humanizing the people with them. That and punitiveness just don't rest easily together.
Do you think that this is all foreign to the people who aren't knowledgeable about the criminal, justice system or, the way these institutions work? Do you think that they even have a clue what's going on? And if they did, would they, is there any help that they could offer? I guess if this got more exposure.
Well, a lot of people do have a clue. If you've grown up the child of an alcoholic, whose alcoholism has led to arrests or, stints in jail, has led to domestic violence, you have a clue, about what doesn't work, in the system, what doesn't protect people. If you've grown up or lived with an abusive partner, you have a clue about how the system lets you down, lets your partner down. Neighborhood you grew up in, you get a real clue, depending on how saturated that neighborhood is with police, when and why, what the police are doing in that neighborhood. You get a line of sight into some of the problems.
I agree with you. I mean, I'm right next to Baltimore, so I couldn't imagine what goes through these kids' minds when they're 6, 7, 8 years old and they hear gunshots outside, and they walk past people dead or nodding out from drugs or needles or whatever the case is. Their mom's on drugs and disappears for 3 days. It's tough. Like you, I don't know exactly what the answer is either.
But I think people whose lived experiences that tend to have an idea about what the answer isn't.
Sure. Yeah. No. Agreed. For the corruption in the system and things like that, do you think that the system corrupts people, or when they obviously there's this hypothetically 18, 19-year-old kid, he goes in the police academy. Do you think he's already corrupted, or do you think the system is a kind of a nature versus nurture type situation? Do you think people are born evil, or do you think that life and situations kind of perpetuate that activity?
I don't think people are born evil. I don't think anybody is evil. I think people do evil things. I think people do bad things. I don't think it makes them evil or anything less than human. Flawed, and some of our flaws for our behavior is more flawed than other people's behavior. I'm not trying to blink any of that away, but no, I don't think anybody's born evil. And if you're going into policing, for example, as an 18 or 22-year-old young person, I suppose there's some people who go into policing thinking they're going to be RoboCop or an Avenger, and that's a bad mindset to go into policing with. You're going to be a servant if you're doing the work well, and you're going to be engaged with your community at all kinds of different levels with a stunningly difficult task of shifting gears, between an 8-year-old kid who just wants to come up and say hi and somebody who's just done something awful, somebody who's been the victim of something awful. That the actual work of police officers who are in this for the right reason in the community is incredibly challenging, just in maintaining composure, treating people with civility, but not hostility, seeing people as humans rather than just as a call, a hitch, a perp, a vic. But I don't think of people as going into this with evil intentions or as evil people. They're not. They're going to be shaped by these institutions much more than they're going to shape the institutions individually. They will be shaped and maybe deformed by the institutions, and it probably would be a really good thing if we figured out how to talk to police recruits about that, how to talk to law students about that, how to talk to new judges or new prosecutors or new public defenders about that, the inexorable pressures that are going to be brought to bear on you all the time, and the dehumanizing effects that they have on you and on the people around you.
Obviously, being a criminal defense attorney, you see people in some really bad spots in their life. When they've made horrible mistakes, they've made decisions they're going to regret for the rest of their life, et cetera, et cetera. Has that shaped your view of humanity any?
Yeah. We're all flawed. We're all frail. And you know, if I hadn't had the advantages I had, would I be finding myself in their chair, not mine? You know, and I don't take a completely deterministic view of human beings by any means. We do have agency, but our opportunities to exercise that agency, our perceived, the perceived scope of that agency really does depend a lot on your life, your lived experience. You know, if the people who should have loved you at an early age didn't, treated you as unworthy of love, it's going to be very hard to love anybody later.
Yeah.
And let alone to love the world and to love people collectively. It's just going to be very, very hard. And for me, at least, working with people who've done terrible things, done some bad things, but have been accused of worse, working with people like that, and people have had terrible things done to them, because you're proximate to victims too when you're defending crime. When you're prosecuting, you're proximate to the offender, you know, or the defendant, you're proximate to his family. So just being in that milieu, where you're seeing a lot of pain and dysfunction, and as you say, really bad choices, I really do think, for me, underscores our shared humanity. Don't mean to make a joke about this, but to my mind, Clarence Darrow sort of nailed this one. You know, when he said it at some point to a newspaper reporter, within all of us, or any of us, there's a murderer. Any of us could be a murderer. He went on to say, now myself, I've never killed anybody, but I have read the obituaries with a great deal of satisfaction, oftentimes. You know,
Yeah.
he captured something there for me, that, you know, I think you want to come away with doing this work.
Sure. Well, Dean, before we wrap it up, is there anything you want to add, or anything on your mind?
I've done a great deal of talking. It's one of my flaws.
No, you were great, man. I appreciate, again, I appreciate you. I appreciate you coming on. I hope we can do it again sometime.
I was honored that you asked.
Thanks, Dean.